Hello, I'm Kinglink, and today we're talking about realism in video games, or more simply, arcade versus simulation gameplay. Now this is a new series I'm starting where I take a topic and just discuss it with you. If you don't know anything about this, that's fine. The goal is to inform and consider a topic. It's intended to make you think and hopefully teach you something new. Before we dive deeper, I want to remind people of one thing that should make this more interesting. I've been a video game programmer for 12 years, I've done a good job with it, so I'm not hoping to not only look at this topic as a fan, but as a developer too, and tell you at least a little of what goes on behind the scenes of a concept. In addition, because I hate when I see something cool and don't know what it's from, we'll be featuring 4 video games today for the video backing. Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed Collection, I'm just going to call that Sonic Racing for the purposes of this video essay, Project Cars 2, Pinball Arcade, and Pinball FX3. Now I've reviewed 3 of these, so you can look for my opinion on them, and we'll talk about a number of other games I've reviewed, and if you check the written review, I'll also link the reviews in the article. So what is realism in video games? Now, I don't like the term realism in video games because it gives the incorrect opinion of a binary idea. Something is real or it's not, and in video games we only try to approach reality in a number of ways, so the more realistic a game is, the better, right? Simple topic. Except that's not the case. There's a spectrum of realism in video games. Think of something as either very realistic or an arcade game. Think of the last video game you played. Was there something that could make the game more realistic or less realistic? Of course there was, probably in both directions. However, realism is a bigger consideration. Everything from how the game plays to what you do in it to the look of the world and even the dialogue affects realism. We have many different types of games. Everything from unrealistic video games like A Story About My Uncle, Slime Rancher, and more, to very hyper-realistic games like Farming Simulator and Euro Truck Simulator 2. But I don't think we need to dive into all of that here. I really want to talk about a specific idea. Now allow me to take a step back and talk about something else. Racing games. I'm sure most people have heard of arcade or kart racers versus simulation racers. On one end, we talk about Forza, Gran Turismo, or Project Cars, and we call them simulation racing games. Whereas Mario Kart, Sonic All-Stars, Transform, Magic Bus Edition, and most racing games are arcade racers. The odd thing is, I really only hear about this idea or concept when talking about racing games. Rather than talk about realistic versus arcade gameplay, I'm going to stick with this idea of arcade versus simulation gameplay when I can for this video, because I think it's easier to think about the topic in that way, at least for me. Again, the problem here is that the realism has this idea of totality, and a lot more involved. Something is realistic or not realistic. However, arcade versus simulation is considered more of a spectrum. Mario Kart is bonkers. You throw shells at opponents and spin them out. Blur, a little-known racer, was similar. Gamers would race the track and shoot weapons at each other. There was also Split Second, where you could trigger huge explosions. Now, all of these have attacks, but arcade racers don't require attacks. Burnout is considered an arcade racer, especially Burnout Paradise, which was just great. Ridge Racer, Need for Speed, all of them, and almost any racing game you see in the arcades. Outrun, Cruising, even the Daytona racing games are pretty arcadey. On the other hand, for simulations, we have 3 games mentioned above: Forza, Gran Turismo, and Project Cars. But there's also Assetto Corsa, iRacing, R-Factor, the entire F1 line of games, and more. What's important though is this isn't a binary option. Mario Kart and Split Second aren't one thing, and Project Cars and Assetto Corsa are a different thing. There are different goals for each game, of course, but as I said, this is a spectrum. Mario Kart is at one end of the spectrum, a very fun and exciting racing game which is built to be the easiest to learn and the most fun racer, and it succeeds. Burnout Paradise, on the other hand, tries to get people to feel like they're driving cars. Of course, they can ram other players and destroy their cars, and recover from massive damage, even magically appearing back on the road, and tries to be the most fun driving game, and it succeeds. Project Cars allows players to experience very realistic driving experiences where they're trying to turn in lap times, and contact with other players is very damaging and to be avoided, except how I play. And it tries to be realistically recreating racing, and it produces a fun experience, and it succeeds. And while I haven't played Assetto Corsa, it takes an extremely realistic view of the car and engine and tries to emulate it on current hardware, so it's super realistic and tries to be fun, and from what I've heard, it succeeds too. All of these games are trying to find different ways to be fun, and they all work. So let me break this down a little further. I have 4 games I'm showing off here. Allow me to discuss them a bit. Sonic Racing All-Stars is completely off the wall. We have a game where Sonic races against a team from Team Fortress 2, Ryu from Shenmue, Danica Patrick, a real race car driver, and Ooh La La from Space Channel 5. WTF. It goes far deeper. The roads are so outlandish none would exist in real life. There are weapons like ice balls, fireworks, and more that are collected and slung at each other. Cars slam into each other with no damage, transforming on race courses. In the Team Fortress 2 case, characters actually change out, and you have Danica Patrick's IndyCar versus a tank versus Outrun the video game. What's going on here? And you know what? It's fun. But Project Cars 2 is all about real cars on real courses with realistic drivers racing the courses as fast as they can, turning in great laps, having realistic driving and amazing wetness, and that feels, well, real. And it's a lot of fun. But what's important here is that neither of these games are bad. They're just different interpretations of what racing is or can be, and that's okay. Sonic can go blow up each other, and Project Cars can accurately replicate Laguna Seca and let me drive my car around it, and players can like both. Neither is necessarily a better game because of the realism, or rather the arcade gameplay versus simulation gameplay. They're different games, but it's a spectrum that only is discussed in racing. Now allow me to use a different example. If you've ever played Smash Brothers, you know you have a very fast action and silly fighting game. The game is very good, but the whole premise makes no sense. Mario and Link run into a battle arena and just decide to smack each other around, knocking the opponent off the screen or down off a floating platform, and then suddenly reappear. Now this isn't a very realistic game, of course, but it's entertaining. Now moving down the spectrum again, we start to see games like Injustice, Street Fighter, or even Mortal Kombat, where we're still in the arcade territory. But we have players ripping off each other's limbs or throwing fireballs, but it gets a little more technical, and at least the beating is semi-realistic. We can even get more realism with games like Tekken. This part of the spectrum is where most fighting games tend to stay, the pseudo-reality where you can shoot each other with guns or throw your robot head at opponents. The thing is, I wouldn't say we're even at the halfway mark. Tekken, while a very technical fighter and admittedly one of my favorites, is more realistic than most fighting games, but there's a whole area beyond this point. UFC, boxing games, wrestling, and more can be realistic. That doesn't mean they're better or worse than popular fighting games, they're just a more simulation-style fighting game out there that doesn't have a lot of popularity. The point is, though, this is a spectrum of arcade versus simulation, realism versus non-realistic gameplay. There's a similar spectrum for shooters, with Arma, Counter-Strike, and America's Army on one realistic arm, and Doom, Far Cry, and Halo on the other. This becomes a question of how many bullets or even weapons a player can carry, how many injuries players can sustain, how to heal injuries and how health is handled, and more. The point, though, again, is spectrum and style. I'm going to play two tables here, one on Pinball FX3 and then one on Pinball Arcade, in that order. Pinball Arcade tries very hard to be a simulation of pinball and gives the player the experience they'll get in the arcade, whereas Pinball FX3's tables are more off the wall and zany. We'll have characters walking around and more. I'm going to be playing the Guardians of the Galaxy table and watch the characters run around, the balls move around, and more. Real pinball doesn't look like this, but it's okay, that's what Pinball FX3 does. On the other hand, Pinball Arcade has the Terminator 2 table, which was a real table and they accurately recreate that. Everything on that table feels like what you would experience if you were playing on a real Terminator 2 table, and that's really impressive. So now that we have at least some understanding of the spectrum, we can talk about what this can mean. Pinball Arcade actually pushes the simulation gameplay, the realism, but if you notice, it's hard to stay alive in Pinball Arcade, and there's really two reasons for that. First off, real tables are not made to be player-friendly. They wanted your quarters and honestly are out to get them, so the accurate recreation will ultimately be leveled against the player, and that's understandable. But beyond that, when you play Pinball Arcade, you're looking for a realistic experience and you want to simulate playing pinball, and in that case, it does a great job. It's harder to play longer games, but very skilled play allows it. On the other hand, Pinball FX3 creates a universe where anything can happen. Gravity can be reversed, controls can be reversed, balls teleport or disappear, and more. There's a lot of really unique experiences in Pinball FX3 that might occur in some arcade games, but are definitely not as common. In addition, the tables in Pinball FX3 are a little easier. They give away ball saves as well as free shots much easier, and it's more about letting the player master the table than trying to steal quarters. That doesn't make it a better pinball game, but it's a different set of values that creates a different game. In addition, the difference is a reason why I have some issues with Pinball FX3 getting the Williams tables. They present a really good experience of them, but when I play both Pinball Arcade and Pinball FX3 with the same tables on each, while Pinball FX3's upgrade, the real unrealistic graphics, are great, I have to say Pinball Arcade is a far better representation of those tables because the entire game feels built around the realistic simulation. Now we'll talk more about that later. Similarly, if you swap the track or the way the controls handle between the Sonic Racing and Project Cars 2, you'd have similar moments of disconnect. Cars and Sonic Racing is all about having fun racing, rubber band AI, and the ability to catch up and survive a few mistakes. You want to have fun in it. Project Cars 2 is less forgiving of mistakes, but that's the nature of real racing, and while rubber band AI is bad in simulation games, people complain about odd things when talking about simulation games such as AI drivers all following the same line. That's somewhat how the actual sport is done. The point is that these entire games exist on the spectrum. Not just the gameplay by itself, but the experience in every part of the game has to be similar. Now I want to talk a bit about how games get this way. I've worked on a number of games, from a very non-realistic or arcadey open-world game known by the name of Saints Row 2, to a more realistic open-world game of Red Faction Armageddon, two carnival games which were heavier simulations than expected, but with magical moments, and then to simulation sports games. Each of these games had different considerations when we worked on it. Every game I mentioned was designed. The fact is, nothing in almost any game is done by random chance, at least not unless it's a bug. Even when a game tries to do random chance, those systems have to be designed and programmed to allow that randomness. Pretty much every game starts with a pitch. Someone has an idea. I might wake up one day and say, what if I could fight space aliens? And let's say I sell that idea. I can have any type of game from Doom to Alien Isolation from that pitch. In fact, most companies won't even accept that pitch because they're not specific enough. Instead, most pitches tend to be very high-level presentations and design documents. There's usually nothing specific or firm, usually because the companies want more of the idea, but rather than saying, what if I could fight space aliens, they'll come up with a plan such as Mario Kart meets Sonic franchise with a huge Smash Bros. Style roster of characters from Sega properties. They might not talk at lengths about realism here, but it's probably brought up at some level. The point is, eventually the company buying the idea or the studio itself decides what game to start working on, and there's a lead designer or producer who becomes in charge of the product. From there, every design decision starts to create the game of their vision. We can talk more about that whole process another time. Ideally though, the designer starts to create design documents. Now this doesn't always happen, and I have some horror stories about that, but the goal is the lead designer should be distributing his idea to the team, usually through an entire design team, who all agree upon what the game should be and feel like. From there, they work out with artists and programmers who help produce the final product. All throughout this process, there are decisions being made. Now, like I said, there's a guiding idea. Let's say we're trying to make Project Cars. There are a ton of decisions at every level that have to be made to make a simulation racing game, and every person will eventually get on board. Most have signed on just to make that specific game in some fashion. This can be everything from car selections to how tracks are represented in the game, laser scanning wheel tracks, menu layout, and more. Think of Sonic Racing's menu and the Project Cars menu. They're very different designs, but they reflect their game well. The same is true for the HUD, the control of the car, and the gameplay elements. Sonic has weapons, Project Cars wouldn't dare think about that. The design of the course and more. Even the style of driving is different. Sonic incentivizes drifting, even giving boosts, whereas Project Cars will rarely reward that. The fact is, these two games are unique, and the driving force behind each game is different. From a very early point, someone decided what Project Cars would be, and what Sonic All-Star Racing Transformed will be, and went with it. Now, this can change in development. When I worked on Saints Row 2, there was a point where the game was going to be similar to the original game. Relatively serious gameplay and story with some activities that were a touch outlandish, like insurance fraud in the original game, to just throw yourself in traffic. Then GTA 4 came along, and just from the trailer, everyone realized how serious GTA was taking itself. It's a real-life simulator in some ways. I'll leave that full story for another time. However, there was a big meeting when we started to talk about our game and what it would be. And I'll be honest, the design team on Saints Row 2 handled it well. They pulled us into a room and said, they want to be the serious game? Fine, we'll let them. We're going to be the silliest, zaniest, craziest game we can be. In the real version, there was a lot more swearing thrown around, but you get the idea. I was working on activities at the time, and the fact is every activity in the game was given another design pass. The idea was no longer how can we make this feel part of everyday life, but how insane could we make it. Insurance fraud, which was simply throwing yourself in traffic, got the ability to launch yourself when you filled up a meter. Escort had outlandish goals and activities, like killing people added, as well as a sex minigame and multiplayer. You're welcome, America. That was one of mine. The story wasn't able to be changed much due to a number of recordings and scenes that had already been created with work that was already done and couldn't be easily changed. In fact, the story definitely has a serious tone to it, but everything else became outlandish as we could make it. I mean, this is still the game where you drive a septic truck around and spray poop on buildings. There was a point where we couldn't come up with a realistic scenario for our water physics and was almost cut before they switched to a sillier game. We were talking about hosing down bums or knocking down shanties. Neither was that entertaining, but spraying houses with poop, that's still hilarious and I just wouldn't have flown in the original style. All of these changes happened when we stopped trying to be realistic and started to move towards a sillier arcadey game. We stopped caring why the player would do something and instead looked at what the player could do that was fun. That doesn't mean we solved the game with the change, but the freedom to go towards a more outlandish pursuits changed the entire game and the franchise, and I think anyone playing Saints Row 1 and Saints Row 2 should be able to see that. Now, Saints Row 3 did take the story along that sillier realm, and while the stuff I have to say about that, again, not at this time. I've worked on a number of more serious titles, and you can even see the changes between Saints Row 2 and the Red Faction series. Saints Row 2 allows the player to be knocked miles in the air and scare people, surviving great damage and for the pursuit of fun. Whereas Red Faction tries to be more of a military third-person shooter, where there's supposed to be a relatively realistic experience. Saints Row 2, you can be a bullet sponge. Red Faction Guerrilla diving into combat is very dangerous, and the player should use more guerrilla tactics. What's important is that none of this makes Saints Row 2 a better game, nor Red Faction Guerrilla. I still love Saints Row 2, and I have opinions on both games, but Saints Row 2 was my first game in the industry and I'm proud of it. But the realism or lack of it doesn't make it a better or worse game, just different experiences. There are other experiences when people wanted to go unrealistic with our carnival game or a realistic sports game that I'm not ready to name yet. There were pushback because design or agreements had made it clear that there was more of a simulation than an arcade game. It's sometimes sad when that happens, but ultimately the game is better for the unified experience. Why does all of this matter? Well, it's an interesting concept that most people don't think up. But let me show you why understanding what type of game you want matters. Imagine you played a game where the player wakes up and has to walk to the bathroom and brush his teeth every time you start the game, then get dressed, have breakfast. Then the player jumps into the car and it's like Crazy Taxi, able to check other cars wildly. However, if a police officer sees the player and they're immediately stopped and given a ticket, and then they have to spend 1 minute waiting in a jail cell. However, when they get out, they can go back to a shooting rampage and almost nothing hurts them. However, they can jump back in the car and it's Crazy Taxi time again. That's a hard game to think of, but there's a reason. None of that game makes internal sense. It's a concept called Verisimilitude, shown on the screen to hopefully make it easier. This is where games need to have internal consistency. In my example, I've made a very realistic opening where you have to wake up normally, then I've allowed the player to rampage around town but gave them a realistic consequences, then allowed them to go on a shooting rampage without consequences. None of these concepts really mesh with each other and it breaks the verisimilitude of the game. Now that's a long word, but think of it as the internal consistency of the game. It's also the problem I have with the Pinball FX3 tables. I played close to 80 tables with very arcade-style gameplay, and suddenly Pinball FX3 pauses and says, no, these tables are real. And for a game that's never been close to realism, it's a major change. The internal game is a very unrealistic game, which is hard to compare to the realism of those 6 tables, I believe. I've come around on those tables, but it definitely takes a long time for me to get comfortable with them, whereas the Archer table based on the TV show took me less than 30 seconds to get a feel of because it was so outlandish in the style of the game. To avoid this video going on forever, I will hold up there, but hopefully these examples give you some idea of why arcade versus simulation game or gameplay is an important concept, or why having a consistent game is important both to the game and to the gamer. The fact is, gamers work when design is firm about what type of game it is, and drives to that point. It's more us as gamers who need to consider more what type of games we're playing, or what about these games are important to us. It might be why I talk about realism in Project Cars, but then turn around and ignore it for Battle Chef Brigade, only to discuss it again in The Division. Bullet sponge central there for everyone but the player. So next time you pick up a game, think not only of how realistic a game is, but also could there be a more or less realistic version of the game. Personally, I thought for a fast moment that Tekken was pretty realistic, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had forgotten about boxing, MMA, and even hockey games that produced a more realistic fighting game. Realistic fighting games is honestly a category of our industry that's been heavily neglected. Even Punch-Out, for all its cartoony graphics, is remarkably realistic compared to most fighting games now. With all that said, I hope I've given you something to think about. This series really isn't about having a firm answer. I can't tell you if arcade or simulation games are better. That's up to you to decide which you prefer. It's okay to have different opinions, or even to prefer a realistic shooter, but an arcadey action game. But if you're now thinking about those elements with those games you play, then I've done my job. A parting thought. Most people like Dark Souls because it's hard. But honestly, I think people really like Dark Souls, not because of the difficulty, but because it's also very realistic, at least in its gameplay. The player dies in a few hits. If attacks hit, they do damage, and rolling out of the way is a strategy. You're not the hero who can have 1,000 arrows buried in him, you're the hero who has to face every enemy as if they can kill you, because they can. This does change the difficulty, but it's not difficult to be difficult, it's difficult because it's more realistic. Now, I want to do more of these discussions in the future. There are a few other topics I already have in mind. Meaningful achievements, microtransactions and what it does to design, even a look at Kickstarter and why fans or game developers get it so wrong, and grind as gameplay. I'm sure there are other topics you can suggest down in the comments, so if any of these sound interesting or there's something you want to hear about, feel free to leave a comment. And if you've enjoyed this, please let me know. It's the first of its kind, so it's brand new, but maybe it's something we'll try again. In addition, as always, consider subscribing. I'm always working on something interesting, so join the group, ring the bell if you want to be notified of new videos. Thanks to everyone who's already joined the group, and we're well on our way to 200 subscribers, and we'll keep working to bring you more interesting content. Until next time, I'm Kinglink, and thank you for watching.